All right, good afternoon and welcome to the NCS4 Online Technology Forum. I'm Daniel Ward. I oversee our training and exercise programs here at NCS4, and today I'll serve as the moderator for this particular forum. So a lot of our time's been spent on how we're going to detect the coronavirus and identify potential carriers. Well, this week we wanted to kind of turn the page a bit, and we wanted to focus our attention on disinfectants or decontamination as a means to prevent the spread of the various contagions as well as the coronavirus. Before we get started on the event and I introduce our speakers, I really wanted to go over some of the housekeeping items on the platform itself. If you're on a mobile device, on the bottom of the screen, you'll see a question mark. That question mark, we encourage you guys to ask questions all the way throughout this event. So field those questions at any point. We'll be reading through those questions and we'll have some built-in Q&A breaks throughout the presentation and on the back end of the presentation where we'll have our presenters answer whatever questions you have. So please take advantage of the question section on the smart device. Again, it's a question mark at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a laptop or a desktop, on the right-hand side of your screen, you have a menu and your questions listed there. Please feel free to again list any questions you might have throughout the presentation as something comes up, and as soon as we get to those Q&A breaks, we'll stop, answer those questions. If we aren't able to get to all of them, we'll try to follow up with everyone immediately after the presentation or in the days following, and we'll certainly take some extra time on the back end if need be to answer your questions. So with that said, there's also a hand raising function. We won't be using that, so please leverage those question sections to pose those questions. And again, we'll be reviewing those throughout the presentation. So for many of us, we define cleanliness as how something looks or smells, what a space looks like and smells like. Well, as we know, as this situations continue to evolve, neither of those things are effective or efficient describing how we can combat this pandemic and future public health concerns in general. So today, again, discussing this topic, we're excited to have the group we do. We have Dr. Mark Tucker, retired technical staff at Sandia National Laboratories. Those of you that are familiar with Sandia, they do a lot of work in the decontamination and disinfectant space. He's also the current Chief Scientific Officer at Decon 7 Systems. We have Joe Hill, the Senior Vice President of Safety, Security, and Defense at Decon 7, and Rob Zaremski. I didn't mess that up, did I, Rob? Okay, perfect. He's the Director of Emergency and Security Solutions at Qualtech. So certainly excited to have the group we do. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get things started with Dr. Tucker.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for this opportunity to speak about this very important and timely topic. So we have a lot of information to cover today, and sorry, I'm having trouble getting this slide to advance. Oh, there we go. So what we'd like to cover today is, first of all, go over some of disinfection basics, just so everyone's on the same page about what disinfection really is all about, the types of different microorganisms we might be disinfecting, and then some important parameters about disinfection, and also some of the regulatory aspects about disinfection. And after we cover some of those basic topics, I'm going to turn my attention to disinfection of the SARS-CoV-2 virus specifically, and especially try to convince you that it's very important to disinfect facilities that may be contaminated with this virus. After that, we will actually be turning it over to my colleagues who will be talking about planning disinfection operations, which is a critical part of the process, and then also talking about disinfection application methods, which again is a very important part of the disinfection process. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, let's just define what disinfection really is all about. So disinfection is a process that eliminates all or most pathogenic microorganisms on a surface, except for bacterial spores. And this, we are specifically focusing on inanimate objects. Of course, things like hand sanitizers and other disinfection or methods for humans may be important, but that's not actually what we're covering today. We're just covering disinfection of inanimate objects, and so that will be our topic today. So disinfection can actually be a physical or a chemical process. Some physical process examples are UV light and heat. Chemical process examples, a lot of us are very familiar with that, things like chlorine, bleach, hydrogen peroxide. Today, we'll actually just be covering chemical process examples and specifically liquid chemicals. There's also the possibility of doing disinfection with gases such as ozone, but that's not something we're going to be covering today. Another thing that we're really going to be focusing on is that the effectiveness of disinfection can be dependent on many factors, such as prior cleaning of the object, how much organic or inorganic load is present on the object or the surface. You can kind of just think about that as about just how dirty the object is while you're trying to disinfect it. The type and level of microbial contamination, the physical nature of the object or the surface, whether it's porous versus non-porous, can be the effectiveness of disinfection can be very dependent on that factor as well. And then finally, other parameters of the disinfection process, such as the time that you're using for the disinfectant, the temperature, the disinfectant concentration, and other parameters. So when we talk about disinfection, obviously our main focus right now is viruses, but disinfection can actually be used for many types of disease-causing organisms. Viruses, fungi, which we often think of as mold, bacteria, which causes many serious illnesses such as tuberculosis, bubonic plague, and then food poisoning. And then something that many of you may not really know about, that's bacterial spores. These are also bacteria, but they're a special bacteria that actually form a very resistant state called a spore that makes them extremely difficult to kill or disinfect. So we are actually not going to be covering that today, but that's something that in disinfection in general, it's a very important topic. Now, if you look at the arrow up near the top of the slide, you see it says resistance to kill or inactivation. So in general, as you move to the right on this slide, the type of microorganism gets more difficult to disinfect. Now, this is a very general statement. Certainly bacterial spores are definitely the hardest thing to kill, but in some cases, some fungi may be less difficult to kill than viruses, or fungi may be more difficult to kill than bacteria. So this is just a kind of a general statement about how resistant these types of microorganisms are to kill. But this is something that's always you need to keep in mind when you're choosing disinfectants, the type of microorganism that you're actually trying to kill. And there are also other infectious agents or pathogens such as protozoa and prions, but today we're going to really be focusing on viruses, which is obviously the cause of COVID-19. So let's look at viruses in general. And a really important statement is that all viruses are not the same. There's structural differences in various viruses that make them easier or harder to kill. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of those structural differences. There's actually quite a few more. And the first structural difference is what's called envelope versus non-envelope viruses. So if you see on the left, there's a schematic of a non-envelope virus versus an envelope virus on the right. And basically the envelope is the circular or the spherical coating that's often an oily lipid layer that surrounds the virus and surrounds the genetic material of the virus as well as other components. Now, this envelope is actually really important for viruses, primarily because you see spikes coming out of that envelope. Those are actually proteins, and they're extremely important in helping the virus infect certain host cells. So basically, in most viruses, if you disrupt or destroy that envelope, you destroy the infectivity of that virus and its ability to infect its host. So that's a very important aspect of a virus. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is actually an envelope virus, so it does have this envelope on it. A second very important structural difference is the genetic makeup of the virus. It's either DNA or RNA. Now, DNA, we're all pretty familiar with what DNA is. RNA is, you can kind of think of it as just a simpler, smaller form of DNA. So some viruses have DNA, some have RNA. It's actually a really important distinction because RNA viruses are actually much more dangerous than DNA viruses because they have the ability to mutate or change, which often makes vaccines or other things ineffective against that virus. So this is also a very important distinction of the virus. So an important thing to remember is that viruses are not actually living organisms. They don't grow on their own. They don't replicate on their own. Their only function is to take over a host cell and cause that host cell to make them replicate. So oftentimes we say in disinfection, we're killing a virus. That's not actually a technically correct term. It's the correct term is actually we inactivate a virus. But just for convenience and because everyone understands it, we often just say we're killing a virus and during disinfection, and you'll hear me say that as well today. So another important factor in disinfection is the level of microbial kill. If you look at different products that are often thought of as disinfectants, there's actually different types of products. And there's 4 different types of products, and they're shown here. And it goes from very low levels of kill to very high levels of kill. So the first type of product is a cleaner, and this basically just aids in removing soil from a surface. It removes the germs, but those germs in most cases are still alive and may still be dangerous. On the second level of microbial kill is sanitizers, and that's actually mostly focused on bacteria on a surface. And this lowers the number of bacteria on a surface, makes it a much safer surface, but still there may be some pathogenic bacteria left behind. This is usually used in either food service environments or in healthcare environments. The level that we're focused on today is actually disinfection. And this is where we actually kill the infectious fungi, bacteria, or viruses on a surface, but we don't kill the resistant bacterial spores. That type of product needed to do that is actually called a sterilant. And that's typically used in healthcare facilities, such as to say kill bacterial spores on medical devices and other surfaces in healthcare facilities. This is really important for those types of facilities because bacterial spores cause many diseases in that type of an environment. So again, our focus today is on disinfection, where we're actually trying to kill, in this case, viruses on a surface. So there are some really important parameters or terms when we talk about disinfection, and some of them are shown here: efficacy, contact time, application rate, soil load, and environmental factors. So efficacy is just basically the level of kill of the pathogens for a disinfectant. It's usually expressed as a percent. For example, on many products, you see something like it kills 99.9% of bacteria, or it's expressed as log kill, a 3 log reduction, for example. Now, I know a lot of people probably don't understand what log kill means, and I'm actually going to explain that in the next few slides because it's a really important term for disinfection. Another important parameter is contact time. So all disinfectants have a contact time that they must be in contact with a pathogen to achieve the desired level of kill. So this is usually something between about 1 minute to 10 minutes. And it's important to note that if you use a disinfectant that say requires a 10-minute contact time, but you only have a 3-minute contact time, for example, you will often not get the desired level of kill. Another important parameter is application rate, and this is simply the amount of a disinfectant that should be applied per unit area or a volume. So it's expressed in something like 2 gallons per 100 square feet of surface area. So again, you need to follow that application rate for disinfectant. If you use too little, you often will not get the desired effect. Another parameter, probably the most misunderstood parameter in disinfection, is something called a soil load. So in the real world, unfortunately, we're not usually dealing with clean surfaces. The surfaces may have soil, it may have organic matter, or in a lot of cases, the pathogen may be surrounded by bodily fluids, which actually interfere with the performance of a disinfectant. So oftentimes a disinfectant will work really well on a clean surface, but as soon as there's a soil load, then the disinfectant may not work nearly as well. And I'll be explaining that in greater detail in a few minutes as well. And then there's environmental factors such as temperature, relative humidity, and other things that need to be considered. I'll just use one example here, temperature, for example. A disinfectant that works fine at 75 degrees Fahrenheit may work really slow at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So those environmental factors need to be considered whenever you're using a disinfection process. So let me go a little bit into log kill. So when we're disinfecting a surface, we're dealing with very large numbers of microorganisms such as viruses. There may be millions or more of bacteria or viruses on a surface. So we need a convenient way of dealing with these very large numbers, or in a very large range of numbers. We may be reducing the number of viruses from 1 million on a surface to close to 0. So we need a convenient way of describing the efficacy of that process. So we often use the log scale. So here's a table that shows what the log scale is. If we are looking at the numbers in the column, the first column, it goes from 1 to 1 million. So basically, every time we move from one row to the next, we're multiplying the number by a factor of 10. So we're 10 to 100 to 1,000 and so forth. And you can see again, very quickly, we're dealing with very large numbers. Well, log scale is simply the number of times we multiply by 10 to get that number. So for example, for 1 million, we multiply 10 by itself 6 times. So that's log 6. And that's simply the log scale. So it's often used in a lot of other places in the world. For example, the Richter scale that describes the magnitude of earthquakes is a log scale. So if you go from a magnitude 5 to a magnitude 6 earthquake, you're actually increasing the strength of that earthquake by a factor of 10. So that's really all that a log scale is. Instead of saying 1 million, we just say 6 log. To describe the number 1 million. So the way we use that, and you can see the log of 100 equals 2, and you may ask that, well, what happens if you don't have a number that's, a perfect multiple of 10? Well, you can do that as well. So the log of 400,000, which is obviously between 100,000 and 1 million, is actually 5.6. So a number between 5 and 6 gives you a number on between 100,000 and 1 million. So the way we use that for the efficacy of disinfectants is shown here. So if we were going to express the efficacy of a disinfectant by percent, you see that in the first column. So if we go up from 0% to 99.9999%, then we're actually going from 0 log kill to 6 log kill, because we're getting a factor of 10 efficacy for every percent kill that we're adding. So the way you look at this is in column 3. If you're starting with 1 million viruses, for example, and you kill at a 90% level, you've got 1 log kill. And you keep going down in the table. If you kill at a 99.9999% level, then you have a 6 log kill. So this is, again, just a really convenient way of describing the efficacy of a disinfectant. And this is used a lot whenever you see data that is showing how effective a disinfectant is. So if we look at this in another way, instead of showing how much we have remaining virus, we're showing how much we're actually killing. So let's go on the far right of this chart. You can see that when we have a 1 log or a 2 log kill disinfectant, that's actually a very low efficacy disinfectant, and we call that a low level disinfectant. If we have a very high level of kill, in other words, a 99.9999% or a 6-log kill, we call that a high level disinfectant. So you'll see this on many products that they will describe their level of kill in either percent or log kill, and this is simply what it means. So the second term I wanted to dive into a little deeper is the soil organic loading. So again, this is a big difference between what happens in lab testing, where often very clean surfaces are used or slightly dirty surfaces, versus the real world, where we often find very dirty surfaces that have dirt, grease, grime, and also in some cases the pathogen itself may be surrounded by nasal mucus or saliva, which also is considered to be an organic load. The problem is that these substances often inactivate chemical disinfectants and make them much less effective or even ineffective. And this is a really important topic in disinfection, that if you know you are disinfecting dirty surfaces or viruses that are surrounded by bodily fluids, you have to take that into account when you're planning a disinfection process. And some disinfectants actually require a pre-cleaning step prior to use to remove this dirt, grease, or grime before the chemical disinfectant is applied. So one example of this is shown on the far right. This is actually some scientific data where it was a bacteria kill test using chlorine bleach. And you can see if the soil load was none in the first row, in other words, a very clean surface, there was a 6-log kill. It was a very, very effective disinfectant. But as soon as some soil load was added, the disinfectant efficacy goes way down, from 6-log down to about 1 log. So that shows that the disinfectant was inactivated, made much less effective by the presence of that soil load. And this is probably the biggest problem with disinfectants that's often overlooked in real use. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So now I want to just turn my attention a little bit to the regulation of disinfectants. This is also a really important topic. Disinfectants are regulated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under a law called FIFRA. And basically, any company that's selling a disinfectant must have submitted very stringent laboratory testing results for specific pathogens to the EPA to be registered under this law. And this law regulates what's called label claims. So if you see a product, for example, that says kills 99.9% of bacteria, they cannot make that claim unless they've submitted their data to the EPA and the EPA has actually approved that. And this is really important nowadays, especially because there are companies out there that are selling unregulated products that are claiming things that are outside of their label claims that are approved by the EPA. So as you choose a disinfectant, it's very important to understand the EPA registration and if the claims that they're making are actually approved by the EPA. Also, there's a special list that the EPA has created called the EPA List N that lists all the disinfectants that they have approved for use against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this is actually available on a website that I'll show you in a second here, that you can find out if a product that you're considering for disinfection is actually on that EPA List N. Now, an important distinction, though, is that just because a disinfectant is on that EPA List N doesn't actually guarantee that it will work against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's actually 3 ways the disinfectant can get on that list. First of all, it's actually been demonstrated to work against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. This is actually not very common because the virus is so new. Most companies just haven't had an opportunity to actually test it against this particular virus. A second reason why it could be on that list is that it has demonstrated efficacy against viruses that are harder to kill than the SARS virus. or it's got demonstrated efficacy against another type of human coronavirus, such as the previous coronavirus outbreak, the virus from that outbreak in the early 2000s. So again, not just because disinfectants are on this list doesn't actually guarantee that they will inactivate the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but they're likely to, just because of the three reasons why I showed you earlier above in this slide. Other important things to note is that this list, the EPA list N, only contains chemical surface disinfectants. It doesn't include hand sanitizers, antiseptic washes, antibacterial soaps, and so forth, because those are actually regulated by the FDA. And the bottom bullet there shows the actual EPA website where you can access that list N. So again, I can't stress this enough. This is just products that the EPA expects that will work against SARS-CoV-2. It doesn't actually guarantee that they will work, but it's a good place to start and a necessary place to start when choosing a disinfectant. Okay, so a few other things. So the EPA approved label on a product is very important. It gives the EPA registration number. You should check out on the EPA website, another website from the EPA, which is shown in the bottom bullet, to make sure that that EPA registration number is actually accurate and valid before purchasing a disinfectant. And the EPA approved label gives a huge amount of information about the product, including the efficacy against various pathogens and the level of kill for those various pathogens. So in other words, it lists all the pathogens that disinfectant can be used against. And then it also gives a lot of information about the ingredients that are in that disinfectant, safety hazard information, directions for use, and even a lot more. This is a pretty complex topic about what's actually on a label of an EPA approved disinfectant, but I definitely encourage you to really pay attention to what's on the label before you purchase and use a disinfectant. Also, another very confusing aspect about disinfectants is that they are actually only approved for hard, non-porous surfaces. So that examples of those types of surfaces are things like stainless steel, other metals, glass, plastics, varnished wood. They are not actually approved for soft, porous surfaces, and some examples of that are like things like carpet and upholstery. So is this confusing? Yes. Does that mean a disinfectant will not work on a soft, porous surface? No, not necessarily. It might work, but you cannot claim, a company cannot claim on their label that it works on a soft, porous surface as a disinfectant. Why? Because the EPA does not actually have a test that shows that a disinfectant works on a soft, porous surface, so you can't make that claim on your label. So instead, there are some reasons why you would believe that a disinfectant would work on a soft surface, porous surface. For example, there's something called a soft surface sanitizer claim that's tested against just bacteria on soft surfaces. Some disinfectants also have that claim. But the important thing to remember is that hard, non-porous surfaces are actually the most dangerous when it comes to disinfection, because that's the surfaces that are most likely to transmit viruses to humans. So basically, that's what you're looking for in a disinfectant, is that it will work on hard, non-porous surfaces. As I mentioned, this is actually a really confusing topic. Again, it doesn't mean that a disinfectant doesn't work on soft, porous surfaces. It just means you can't claim that on your label because of the fact that it's there's no test to prove that. And then finally, the last thing I want to say about regulation of disinfectants is that there are special rules for disinfection of food contact surfaces. These are surfaces like that you might find in a restaurant or a food serving area, countertops, beverage equipment, things like that. It doesn't actually include the tables that people eat on. And this is basically surfaces that might come in contact with food, direct food, not packages of food, but the food directly itself. And some disinfectants require a pre-cleaning step before they're used on food contact surfaces. Others actually require a rinsing step after they're used on these surfaces. So that's, again, something you need to pay attention to on the label. So let's move on to types of disinfectants. As I mentioned earlier, there's two basic types of disinfectants. There's chemical and physical processes. So physical processes are things like UV light, heat, even sonic and radiation. These are actually considered devices, and they're not on the EPA list N for COVID-19. The regulatory aspects of these devices is actually a very complex topic as well, and I don't really have time to go into that. But the important thing to note is that these types of processes are not actually on the EPA list N for COVID-19 at this time. So we're not going to really be covering that today. Instead, we're going to be looking at chemical processes. And in that case, there's two basic types of chemicals. There's liquids and there's gases. Gases also are not on the EPA list N, and we're not going to be covering that today. Liquids are usually an aqueous solution, in other words, a solution containing water that are used for inanimate surfaces. And sometimes they're sold as powders that are solids that are dissolved in water, but they're normally aqueous solutions. And some examples of this are chlorine bleach, hydrogen peroxide, ethyl alcohol, and so forth. And I'll be getting into that in more detail in these next two slides. There's basically several classes of chemical disinfectants. And again, this is a very complex topic because there's many disinfectants to choose from. Again, as I said, there's different classes, say, for example, a class that contains alcohols, a class that contains chlorine. All these different types of disinfectants have the advantages and disadvantages that are shown in these tables. And I don't really have time to go through all these advantages and disadvantages now. It's just important to know that all disinfectants are not the same. They're made up of many different types of chemicals, and you should examine the labels and work with experts to determine what are the best disinfectants for your particular facility. There's actually several more classes shown here. Now, by far, the biggest disadvantage of almost every single class of these disinfectants is the fact that many are inactivated by organic or soil loads. In fact, if you look at the disadvantages in each of these columns, almost every one of the different classes says that they're inactivated by organic or soil loads. There is one exception. There's kind of an emerging class of disinfectants, which I call the combination class. And this typically contains some sort of an oxidizer, like hydrogen peroxide, peracetic acid, plus detergents. And the big advantage of this class of disinfectants is that these detergents actually cut through the organic loads, the soil load, and actually get to the viruses and the bacteria and other pathogens embedded in those loads. So these are typically the most active in the presence of organic loads, or most active in the presence of bodily fluids, such as bodily fluids that often surround viruses and bacteria. And then finally, before I move on to SARS specifically, application methods are important. We're going to actually be talking about that in a lot more detail in a few more minutes by my colleague Rob, and he's going to be talking a lot more about the various application methods for disinfectants. But this is actually a really important topic, and the red box over on the right is something that's often overlooked, even though it sounds pretty trivial, is that a disinfectant must actually contact the virus to work. If you spray a disinfectant on the top of a table and the virus is on the bottom of the table, that disinfectant is not going to kill that virus. So you have to choose an application method that actually reaches the virus in all the places that virus may be. So now I want to turn specifically to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's obviously been a lot in the news, so I won't go a lot into the details. We know it's obviously caused a huge problem all over the world. I just want to stress that I think one of the main reasons why it's such a serious problem is because it is an RNA virus, and I talked earlier about the fact that these types of viruses can often mutate and make vaccines or other chemicals ineffective against them. So it's a very dangerous type of virus. In fact, most of the emerging diseases are RNA viruses because of that fact. So again, a lot of this is in the news. We have a lot of information about how we think SARS is spreading. Normally, it's spread through either coughing or sneezing. And the important thing here is that coughing and sneezing emits a very large number of droplets. And I'll show you on the next table some estimates for those large number of droplets, but it's an extremely large number. But the important point on this slide is that some of those droplets are really small and they stay airborne for a really long time. And that's the droplets that people often inhale, and the reason why we're trying to wear masks and do other things to protect ourselves, social distancing and other things. But for disinfection, the most important droplets are actually the large droplets that typically fall quickly out of the air and onto surfaces. Now, these large droplets, which are typically about 600-700 microns, or which is a micron is a millionth of a meter, so they're actually visible by the eye. And again, they fall quickly to surfaces and often contain very large number of viruses. And this is what a person would typically touch and get into their mouth or eyes or nose or into their body in some way. So for disinfection, these are the important droplets that we are concerned about, not so much the airborne droplets. So here's some estimates about the number of droplets that are emitted from various human activities. And the bottom two rows are the ones that are really the most important. Coughs and sneezes emit huge number of droplets. And these droplets, again, are anywhere from about 2 or 3 microns all the way up to about 1,000 microns. The large droplets fall out very quickly and contain very large numbers of viruses. The actual number of viruses hasn't really been studied all that well. There have been some studies that have looked into this. What we do know is that SARS has a very high viral load, meaning when a person is infected, they have a very large number of viruses, primarily in their upper respiratory tract. And what happens when they cough or sneeze, these viruses are emitted. And there's been a recent study that shows that it's estimated that from a single sneeze, as many as 200 million of these viruses could be emitted from an infected person. Now, this is a huge number of viruses and goes back to the problem we were talking about earlier. That is, if you use a disinfectant on a surface that has a low efficacy, you may very well be ending up with a lot of active viruses still on a surface. So this is just an example. If you have some droplets that fall to a surface and only contain 1% of those 200 million viruses that may be emitted in a sneeze, that's 2 million viruses. If you use a disinfectant with a low level of efficacy, here's what happens on the right of this chart. You see that if you use a disinfectant with a 1 or 2 log efficacy, you're leaving thousands, even hundreds of thousands of active viruses behind, because the efficacy of the disinfectant only kills a certain percentage of those viruses. And all the way up to about 4 log efficacy, or 99.99%, you may be leaving a large number of active viruses. Now, the infectious dose for SARS is thought to be around 1,000 viruses. So just for this example, if you don't use a disinfectant that has over a 99.9% or a 3 log efficacy, you may be leaving an infectious dose on that surface. So it's very important to consider this when you're choosing disinfectants, that you're choosing a disinfectant that will achieve a high level of efficacy to be able to kill enough viruses so that you're not leaving an infectious dose on a surface. And so this is actually a study that shows how many viruses remain on a surface over time. So again, we're using our log scale that we learned about earlier. If we look at the chart on the left, this is for viruses on a plastic surface. We start with 6 log viruses, which is about 1 million viruses. To get down to a remaining virus level that's down to a fairly safe level, it may take 4 or 5 days for those viruses to actually die off by themselves. And this is primarily because when you cough and sneeze, an infected person that's infected by SARS, if they cough or sneeze, these viruses are often protected by bodily fluids, and they'll survive on surfaces for a very long time, which again leads to the reason why you would want to choose a disinfectant that is not inactivated by the presence of organic matter or bodily fluids, and will actually cut through those bodily fluids and reach those viruses and kill them. Okay, just a couple more slides about SARS. So we're often asked, what about sunlight? Does that kill the SARS-CoV-2 virus? The answer is yes, to some extent. So this is a study that showed virus kill on a summer day, 40 degrees latitude, which is basically the latitude through the middle of the US at noon. And you can see on the chart on the left, we start with 3.5 log virus, which is about 100,000 virus or so, actually 10,000 viruses. And over about 20 minutes in that intense sunlight, we get down to a pretty safe level. However, on a winter day, it's not so good. There's still a lot of viruses left, even at noon on a winter day with that sunlight intensity. But even more concerning is if we get into darkness or a shady area, there's almost no viral kill at all. So yes, you can utilize sunlight in a lot of cases to kill the virus, but it has to be direct sunlight at a fairly high intensity. And then finally, heat inactivation of the virus. Does that occur? Again, the answer is yes, but the SARS-CoV-2 virus is much more hardy in heat than most viruses. Most viruses, if your body, for example, has a fever about 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so, it kills off a lot of viruses. What we find with this particular virus is you have to get up to about 130 F, even up to about 140 F to get a significant level of kill of the viruses. So in most cases, you're not really going to get a lot of kill from the heat itself, and so that really leads to the need for a active surface disinfection process and not relying in most cases on sunlight or heat. So in summary, for my part of the presentation is that I hope I've convinced you that surface disinfection of SARS-CoV-2 is necessary, because these high viral loads that are often emitted from an infected person can leave a large number of viruses on surfaces. These viruses may survive on surfaces for many hours or days, primarily because of the fact that they're surrounded by these bodily fluids, nasal mucus, saliva, etc., from people. And then finally, heat and sunlight will have some effect on the virus, but certainly not as effective as other types of viruses to kill those viruses. So in summary, like I said, I firmly believe that surface disinfection is very, very important in facilities that may be contaminated with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So I think at this time we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And first, as you'll all notice, we dedicated a significant portion of this presentation to going over the science behind disinfecting and some of the specifics we need to know and discuss as an industry. So largely, most of the comments have been thanking you for making something that's typically scientifically complicated very understandable to the majority of the group. So only a couple questions here before we move on, and we'll open the floor again on the back end of the presentation for questions. And if we do have to to linger a bit on the back end, we are more than welcome to answer some of those questions as a group, but we do understand some of you have to have tighter schedules and have to get off at the top of the hour. So first, yes, this presentation is going to be available on our website after the fact. It may take a day or two to pull down everything, but we'll make the PowerPoint as well as the video available and viewable for all of you after the fact. So first question we have here, Dr. Tucker, is we talk about a lot of the solutions and how we can disinfect a dirty surface, for lack of a better word. But is there a solution that protects a surface after it's applied? So is there anything that we can put down to protect our surfaces beforehand?
So the answer to that is yes, there are some disinfectants that have some residual killing effect after they're applied to a surface. So if you apply that disinfectant, some disinfectants may actually keep working for a few days, maybe even longer after that. This is actually a pretty tricky subject though, because in a lot of cases, they will work fairly well in a laboratory setting. But again, in the real world, you know, dirt, grease, grime then also covers those disinfectants, the residual. So they often do not work very long after they're applied, even if there's a residual claimed, a residual effect claim.
Hey, Daniel, this is Joe. Could I add something to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to add is, you know, when you check the label, which Dr. Tucker talked extensively about, because typically you're going to run into somebody making a marketing claim. So you look at the marketing claim, then what you want to do is you want to take that marketing claim, look the label up, and see exactly what the label says. And what you'll find a lot of time is that residual effects is for odor-causing bacteria, not disease-causing bacteria or anything else. So if you run into one of those products, make sure you check the label and make sure you see what the residual effects are actually on. Generally, it's for odor-causing bacteria.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I know coming from the public safety community, a lot of our solutions are put as copious amounts of water down or throw as much bleach on it as possible. So I really appreciate the perspectives and the insights you all have. So with that said, I know, Joe, you had spoken up. I believe the next segment of the presentation is yours.
Yes, thanks, Daniel.
Over to you.
Yeah, first let me apologize to the group. Through some extenuated circumstances, I wasn't able to be sitting in a nice quiet office, and I find myself at the airport. So I apologize for that, and you may catch some background noise, and again, apologies. So real quickly on me, my background is nuke chem biodefense, and I did that for 10 years in the Marine Corps, and then I did it for 10 years as a contractor. During that time, I found myself doing chemical and biological type of operations, where in the military, we often refer to it as decontamination, but here we're talking about disinfection. So I've done disinfection, decontamination operations, and during Operation Iraqi Freedom, as a contractor, I did it through Africa for in the Middle East for other outbreaks and stuff there. I responded to 9/11, and then I also was part of the response to the Fukushima disaster as well as in my time. And now I find myself here with Decon 7, trying to make the least part of CBRN operations as, for lack of a better term, as sexy as it can get. That's when we go out and do a lot of these operations, we typically just wave our hand and say, oh, we magically did our disinfection and our cleanup and our decontamination, because that's not the fun part. The fun part's getting in the suit, getting the respiratory protection on, going down range and doing your sampling and your detection and doing your problem solving that comes with that. And by the time you do that, you come up range, you're typically worn out by that time. So you kind of just gloss over doing decontamination or disinfection. So it's nice to be here and talking about these things with the group. So Daniel, I don't have control. So if you could move forward for me. Or Dr. Tucker, if you still have control of the presentation.
All right, you should have control, Joe.
Okay.
Click on the screen. Perfect.
All right, so when we get into disinfection planning, I know we're running short on time, so I'm not going to read the slides to anybody since they'll be available, but one of the things I guess the big takeaways that you're going to see throughout this is the cautionary tale I want to put out there is there's a lot of businesses and companies that are popping up and trying to take advantage of the current situation. So when you're going out and putting your disinfection plan together and you're calling on a company to come assist with this, make sure that they've been doing this for a while and it's something that they actually are experts and have expertise in, versus, you know, somebody that said, oh, this would be a great opportunity for me to put, you know, some of my employees back to work, and those sorts of things. Very noble endeavors, but really looking to see, do they understand what the label is? Do they understand what the chemicals are? Do they understand what the mechanisms of disinfection actually are? Do they understand the application portion of it and all that, and can put it together and actually provide some sort of, you know, actually expertise on how to protect your businesses and how to protect your people. And when you talk about disinfection planning, really what you're talking about is risk mitigation, risk reduction, and risk management. So how you put your plan together is really going to be determined on what's your level of risk that you want to assume, and that piece is really going to depend on what resources you have, how much time you have, and what budget you have. But the most important thing is that you can fit and put together a proper disinfection plan with any resources, any amount of time, and in any budget. So those are really the things you want to look at when you're putting your plan together. Yeah, so the step one we have here is again, you know, identifying the first step in the process is selecting the disinfectant and your application method. If you're able to use and train your internal staff, that's always going to reduce your cost. If you have to bring consultants on, or you have to bring a third-party company on, then again, make sure they're reputable, and on top of that, know that, you know, that it's going to increase your costs, at least on the front end. So if you bring them in to do training, train your staff, you can bring them in on the front to really get your internal people up to being comfortable with the disinfectant that they're using, with the application method that they're using. And then as they get that expertise and that experience, then you can kind of back off and table down any consultants that you have or any third-party company that you have doing this. And then when you look at step 2 here, it's looking at, you know, your facility evaluation. So again, you know, when I go in, and if I was doing this as a Marine or a public safety, we'd go in and we take a look and see what does the facility look like? What are there different areas in there? Are there public areas? Are there non-public areas? Are there high touch inside the areas? Do we have high touch areas? Where can I keep people out of? Because part of what you're going to do is, in order to reduce your risk, is to keep people out who don't need to be in the area. So I know you're probably going to a lot of places now. I was up here with Alameda Fire this week, and when I went into their facility, they hit me with a temperature gun. They made me wash my hands and disinfect my hands and do all these things. So those are other pieces that you can add to your plan in order to ensure that you're not getting the possibility of contamination inside there, as you divvy up your kind of spaces where you make, hey, this is for employees only. And then if you go a step further and you're like, these are for specific employees only. So you're able to do that within your facility as well. And then whether you're outdoor, whether you're inside, I talked about the high and low traffic and high touch points. Talked about all those. All right, now we get into kind of step 3. We're going to design our disinfection operations. And what I've found throughout this is that, you know, most places that are running a cleaning and sanitizing program, we've been able to, or it's very easy for them to implement disinfection within their cleaning and sanitizing program that they're already running, whether it's, you know, they have a nightly cleaning staff that comes in and cleans the office, or if it's a sports facility where they, you know, each individual space does some sort of cleanup. And if you've got concessions in there, they're going to do their food surface sanitizing and all those other types of things. Well, really all you're going to do is make space and make some time and put some resources towards adding a disinfection step in there. And in most cases, you'll be able to find that if you've got compartmentalized spaces within your facility, then those crews that are typically doing the cleaning and sanitation can just add that as a step to what they're doing. And then if you've got your larger spaces where you have to bring a specialized staff on, maybe you want to hit restrooms and that sort of thing, especially if they're public restrooms and large sports facilities, then you probably want to have a specialized team that goes in there. High traffic areas, high touch areas. Some of the other places would be your seating. So those are high traffic area, high touch areas. So you may add additional staff and additional resources to that, to those specific areas. And one of the things that you want to keep in mind here in selecting your disinfectant and your application is, what are the types of materials that you have in these spaces? Because if it's a hard non-porous surface like the concrete stairs going up and down the stadium, and then they have plastic seating across there, I could probably just apply in a foam and or a spray, which would give me heavy droplets on those areas. But if I was going to use the disinfectant in an area where I have sound and video equipment, I have computers, I'm not going to apply it the same way in those areas that I would in this place that has a lot of hard non-porous surfaces. So that's another thing to keep in mind in selecting your disinfectant and your application method. Los centros de prevención y control de enfermedades recomiendan el distanciamiento. And so I kind of briefly talked about this already, your disinfection operational personnel. So this can be done with your current staff that you already have, particularly if they're already trained up on some cleaning and sanitizing protocols as it is, then it's going to be very easy to get them trained up on adding the disinfection step to there, which at the beginning may have to bring a consultant or contractor in to do that on the front end, or just run some sort of combination in order to kind of keep your costs lower, but then also ensure that you're getting your high efficacy, and you're ensuring you're getting your surfaces and your facilities properly disinfected. And then the last step here would be actually conducting the disinfection operations. So you could put that plan together, you could isolate your different areas, identify them as public and non-public, and then go even a further step for your non-public spaces and have essential personnel only in these areas. And then all that's going to go into kind of your frequency that you're doing your disinfecting, and then and also what application method that you're using in each of those different kind of locations. And then of course you want to monitor your operations, see if they're working. At the beginning of this, worked with clients who were applying every day, a few hours a day, and then if they've gotten comfortable, then they've lowered their application process down. So that's when you do your reassessment. And of course, if you got people in the building all the time, you want to continue to incorporate disinfection into it. But if you go on a long period of time where there hadn't been people in there, then you might not have to use such an extensive disinfection program. So really, you got to take all those elements into account when you put what you're planning together, and then constantly reevaluating and reassessing what you're doing. Do you need to increase in certain areas? Did you need to lower things in certain areas? And your plan, should be as dynamic as the situation that you're into. But part of this is also peace of mind. It's peace of mind to the patrons that are coming to your facilities, and also your employees as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're putting your plan and stuff together too, because there's some things out there that talk about disinfection theater. And I'm not in the business of disinfection theater. That's not, for me, that's not what it's about. My passion is about protecting the public. And so I think, if you take that in mind, and that's really what you're looking for, is to protect your people and protect your facilities, and then protect the patrons and stuff that come there, and you put that into your disinfection operations, and you'll see the most value out of it. So as to kind of wrap up some of the things that Dr. Tucker spoke about, and then and to put it in the context of your disinfection plan, really what you're want to look for here is the broad spectrum of microorganisms. As these emerging pathogens and things come out, having something that is broad spectrum, that works on funguses, it works on bacteria, does it work on spores, does it work on other types of viruses, that's a broad spectrum disinfectant, or one element of a broad spectrum disinfectant. Another one is to be able to use it in multiple, in various environments, from cold weather to warm weather to high humidity to low humidity, to clean environments to dirty environments, all those different types of things. That's what makes something broad spectrum. And to have multiple application methods as well, from spraying to wiping, to foaming, and all those other types of applications that are out there. And when you start talking about your toxicity and corrosive properties, that's what you're talking about. There is your material compatibility. So every space is going to have different material in it. So if you pick, if you had battery acid, maybe a great disinfectant, but if you put battery acid on something, it's going to damage your surfaces. So they always make sure that you're selecting the right disinfectant for the materials and things that you're putting it on. And some of these hidden areas down here, if you see some of the bullets at the bottom, let's talk about getting into your HVAC systems and these other things. If you're able to use a disinfectant that can be applied via a sprayer that gets the droplets and the small microns close to what somebody may refer to as a fog or a mist, then those things can get high. You can get them up into your HVAC systems where things could be trapped. So those are all other things to take in consideration when you're looking at these things. And and this last one that Dr. Tucker talked about a lot is the remaining effective in heavy organic soil loads and bodily fluid, because these things are tested in a test tube or a petri dish in a lab, where guys like me who've used them for over 20 years have to use them, isn't in a lab in a petri dish. It's in some of the dirtiest and inhospitable environments that are out there, and I still need whatever that is to work in that environment. And that's all I have, Daniel.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you. I know, as many of you are noticing now, we're getting a little past the top of the hour. This was we knew that this one was going to be hard to fit into the 1 hour time frame. Very ambitious here. So again, this slideshow will be available after the fact. We'll make the presentation available on our website. You'll be able to go back and watch that with your team, reference these slides. We won't email them out because it is such a large presentation, but again, it will be available to you on our website in the next day or two. So with that said, we're going to move along. I do have a couple questions, and we will absolutely get to those questions. We'll just get to them after. I know Rob has a couple things to discuss with the group, and then we'll get to those couple questions that have been arriving. So last but certainly not least, Rob, go ahead and all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, I just had something catastrophic happen, and my computer shut down. So I'm going to try and get through them, but is there someone that could move the slides on for me?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm trying to boot back up here, but it may take a minute. So first and foremost, we talk about application methods and the things that we need to determine, and Joe hit on a lot of the stuff that I'm going to go through. So, I'll try to keep this brief and keep us as close to not go too far over. But when you look at facilities, you look at things like the overall size of the facility, in square footage and cubic footage. And then we also have to look at all the unique features that Joe was talking about, the materials, hard to reach areas, not just, HVAC systems, but, congested areas with a lot of equipment, a lot of different things that, may be used, I'm thinking in the NCS4 space, team rooms, locker rooms, things like that, where you have a lot of things and a lot of areas that viruses and contagions can hide. And then the other thing to keep in mind when we talk about different application methods is the occupancy. So there are methods that can be used after hours, and then there are simpler methods that can be used while the facilities are occupied, whether it's schools or ball fields, whatnot. So if you go to slide 2, the first application method we talk about is cold fogging. And cold fogging is either driven by electric or compressed air, or typically driven by electric compressed air, and it's to apply disinfectant in extremely fine mist over broad areas. Cold fogging is good for getting it into tough spaces because of the mist capability that you're able to do and the distance you're able to shoot. And then you can go to the next slide, is electrostatic spraying. So similar to cold fogging, electrostatic spraying uses an electrode to place a negative charge to atomize droplets of disinfectant. And then these droplets will be sprayed towards surfaces, and your hard surfaces are naturally positively charged, and the droplets are magnetically attracted. And it is an excellent way on coverages, especially in hard to reach areas. Next slide, please. So the next slide just talks about spraying, and these are things that we're all more accustomed to. We may not have heard of cold fogging or electrostatic spraying in the past, but your different spraying methods, while this isn't the most ideal because it's easy to over-apply product, is necessary in specific areas where you might have gross contamination and things of that nature where you do need more product. But from a cost-effective standpoint, strictly just spraying, you'll likely overuse the product. It'll be more costly, and there's also potential, depending on your disinfectant, if leaving any residual behind causes any issues, whether it's a danger to the public, it's corrosive to equipment or whatnot. And then the next slide is just what we're all familiar with in wiping and mopping. So those, from a methodology standpoint, while those seem to be the simplest and most commonly used in a custodial manner, they are still very much needed, especially as Joe pointed out, for high traffic areas. If I think of large scale sporting events, if the facility's open, you have numerous amounts of people going in and out of bathrooms and touch points on doors and things like that. You can continuously wipe, where coming in and cold fogging or electrostatic spraying would be something that you would want to do in a more controlled environment. You can go to the next slide. So, and again, I apologize because I don't see the slides in front of me, but I believe this is just talking about different types of application equipment, and that they come in various form factors, from handheld all the way up to engineered systems. And we'll go through on the next slide just some picture pages, so that you get an idea of what some of these systems look like if you haven't already looked into them or you don't already have some of them available to you. But just to know that there are many different application methods for all sizes of facilities, and really just about any problem that you could encounter when you're trying to disinfect. So the last slide in my portion is showing you the different equipment types. And when you go through and when you're doing an audit of your facility, or if you have somebody come out and help you audit your facility, that's when you'll direct as to what you're capable of doing. A good, for instance, is with the engineered systems. You could think of those just like you would a fire suppression system. If you have open architecture, inside your facility, and you wanted to come in and set those up and have them run back to a command station that's on a timer, and you could have your facility fogging itself, while nobody's in there, for a specific amount of time to deliver a specific amount of disinfection product. And then there's also mobile portable capabilities in the same way. Cart type foggers, what we refer to as cart foggers. I can push it into place, fog up to 8 different directions and up to 25 to 30 feet at a time. So those type applications are available, but again, it comes back into engineering your plan, your design. What are your restrictions and what are your limitations? And if you need any help with any of that, we left a contact page on the very end of this. Please feel free to contact us and let us know how we can help. But in a general sense, just to summarize, and if you'll go to the next slide, I believe that's summary. To summarize, some of the key points that Dr. Tucker made is, look into your disinfection or the disinfecting products that you're deciding upon. When we talk about 99.9% as a general public in efficacy or kill, listen, if one of my kids comes home with 99.9% on their history exam, that's a high five all day long. When you're talking efficacy regarding things like viruses and whatnot, look at those 200 million viruses that can be in a single sneeze. And if you subtract 99.9% of that on your calculator, you're left with over 200,000 viruses. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Tucker had mentioned that it takes about 1,000 viruses to get somebody ill. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the labels very strongly and making sure that we understand it. If not, reach out. Dr. Tucker's an expert, Joe Hill's an expert, and they're very willing to help you. Reach out through us, and we'll set up whatever we can to help you understand what it is you're considering or what you may already be using. And with that, Daniel, I'd really like to thank you and NCS4. It's been a pleasure working with you folks over the past probably 14 years. But thank you for this opportunity to bring this education to your group, and I hope that it's been effective and helpful.
Absolutely, and we're certainly excited to have you all. So before I hand it over for any type of closing remarks you all might have, a couple questions we do have here I wanted to get to, and perhaps this first one might be for you, Dr. Tucker. This one's coming from the world of manufacturing, pulp and paper, mines, petrochem, utilities. So specifically, the comment was a gentleman had said we're using UV light to kill the virus in the office. And the question was, what's the smart answer there?
So like all disinfectants, I mean, UV light is going to have some effectiveness, but the thing about UV light is that the virus has to actually be directly exposed to that UV light for a sufficient period of time. And the thing that people often forget is that there's shading. Viruses are protected by shade, by even other viruses. For example, if one virus is on top of another virus, that bottom virus may often not be inactivated by the UV light or killed by that UV light. So UV light has, it has some effectiveness, but if you're really looking for high levels of virus kill, UV light is not usually the answer.
And if I could add to that, Daniel, a lot of ambulances nowadays come with UV lights in them just to help for this purpose. And an ambulance is still to clean and disinfect their ambulances because, as what Dr. Tucker was saying, there's a lot of shaded areas in there. And the other piece is that UV lights damage some of the instruments on the inside of the ambulance. So ambulance companies, or, public or private, that have the UV lights still use a disinfectant that clean for C. diff and some other things inside there that they found that those UV lights have not been successful for them.
Great points. Well, this is more of a statement, and it's spot on from our friend Stacy. She had mentioned that there are going into restaurants and certain areas, you can certainly see that there is a lot of bad habits that result in cross-contamination. I do think, obviously, I think that those are a lot of the processes and procedures we're working to put in place more than anything to protect our staff. So I know we didn't spend a whole lot of time focusing on cross-contamination, but I know that there has been ample discussions regarding how we're going to start incorporating public health and some of these procedural things into our venues. But you're absolutely right. Cross-contamination is a major point of emphasis and a concern at this point in time. So The next question is, what about autonomous robots that both spray and irradiate? What are our thoughts or experiences in those areas?
Joe,
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so again, if you've got the robot that has is doing a UV application on it, it's one of those things that, you know, if it requires X amount of UV light for X period of time, then that robot has to slowly move all over every inch of the surface in order to get the proper application. And generally, a lot of things on the insides of buildings aren't made to be UV, to be protected by UV. So if you start doing that, you're going to start breaking down your materials, and it's going to be very time consuming if you use that application. But there are robots out there that also are applying a disinfectant, a liquid disinfectant, and those are, you just become another application tool. And generally, using chemical disinfection is generally going to be have higher efficacy. It's going to take less time, and it's going to take less money than using one of, you know, these other types of UV or physical types of disinfection. But a robot's a nice applicator, and we deal with several public safety departments, fire departments, police departments that like using them in certain instances, and definitely the military uses them as well, because some disinfectants can go through an applicator that applies a firefighting foam. So some of these robots are already spraying firefighting foam, so you could put disinfectant in there and apply it. And you know, when you're doing things like that, those robots are really, in my mind, for large spaces, large, you know, kind of large outdoor spaces, versus, you know, I'm not putting a robot in a, you know, a 500 square foot office to do an application.
Great points. And I'll say, I know on the DoD military side of the house, foam is something we've worked with for years, and the idea behind it was a lot of those large outdoor surfaces, bleachers, facilities, roadways, etc. We would put down that foam solution and let it sit over a period of time, so it's having constant contact with that surface and breaking down those materials. I know that a lot of our venues, especially, talk about the various surfaces and the protective layers and things like spit and snot. Unfortunately, I know it sounds gross, but a lot of those things are ever present in our venues, and certainly a challenge when it comes to disinfectant and decontamination. The next question I have,
Daniel,
yeah.
if I could add one quick thing to the robotics piece too. If there are folks out there using robots, one thing to consider in your disinfectant is the corrosivity of it. So you have a very expensive piece of equipment in that robot, and if you're using something that's continually corrosive or corrosive to it, it could be a very broken and expensive piece of equipment, or you're going to have a lot of time keeping that the surfaces of that robot clean and so forth.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point. And as it relates to equipment, I know we saw an article a week or two ago, and it was focused on using drone technologies and those types of things. And those are excellent areas that we're exploring. But certainly right now, one of the biggest issues is getting enough decontaminant or disinfectant on the surface to deal with the issues. And obviously, some of those, it's a little harder to attach that type of payload to effectively disinfect. Most of the disinfectant we've seen, that's why we have the foggers and the sprayers and the large tanks that are commonly leveraged to put the disinfectant down. One of the questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm sorry, Daniel. I was going to just add to that. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. Is when you're using a drone, it has a payload, and then if that drone has a payload, then it's also going to have an applicator on it. And so, I know there's a lot of drone companies out there. So one thing to keep in mind, going back to a label, is once you start making a disinfecting claim with a particular applicator, then you have to test to that applicator, and that has to be on your label. So for, and as we know, regulations are never able to keep up with the emerging natural environments and stuff that we live in. So as these technologies come out, being able to use them is, regulation's always going to be a step behind. But there are other drone companies out there that are using drones in tandem with one another, and then it's the drone number one is carrying an approved applicator already. So, and it's not carrying a payload. The payload's actually on the ground. So drone 2 does your hose management. Drone 1 actually does your application. And currently there's nothing wrong with that because it's not a new applicator and you're not having to worry about any sort of payload or any sort of label claim that has to be made. So there is ways to use drone technology if you're interested.
Absolutely. And I think the big thing there, as Dr. Tucker said earlier, is making sure that we're putting the disinfectant on the surface that we want to disinfect. So the next question I have, and probably one of the more important questions for a large majority of the group, is what type of expert do we hire to bring into the facility to advise or consult on the disinfection process that they have in place? Do they need to bring in an environmental engineer? How would they approach that to make sure that they're again taking the right precautions and getting the right equipment for their particular facilities and venues?
Yeah, so I guess if you're stopping short of bringing somebody in to, like Rob was talking about, one of those large application systems that would actually go throughout your entire, or at least portions of your facility, and would be embedded into the infrastructure. If you're talking at that level, then yes, you would need engineers and whatnot to be part of that project. If you're talking about just coming in and having somebody, take a look at your type of facility, your type of materials, and those sorts of things, really what you want to look at is a company that's been in business for a few years and understands label. I mean, Dr. Tucker gave a pretty good class on understanding labels. If you're interviewing companies or consultants and they're selling to you off a brochure or marketing material, then that should be a red light of what you're dealing with. When you're interviewing companies, take a look at it. If they're talking about their label claims, if they're actually adding color to what 99.9% means, what soil load means, and if they're able to answer those sorts of questions and provide test data, then you've got somebody that understands and knows what they're talking about. A lot of these companies, because it's not necessarily specialized labor, then they're paying people just to come in and do an application. That person, all they really know is how to read the directions on the label, pour it in, and do an application of it. And nothing wrong with that. It's just that some people's experience with this. But if you got somebody that's talking ingredients, that's talking methods of disinfection, that's talking soil load, that understands log kill and labels, then when you're taking a look at your company, then that's how you can initially start vetting them to come in. And once they come in, they'll be able to look at those spaces and make recommendations for what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it.
Absolutely, and I'm going to start wrapping up right there. Certainly, I wanted to list Rob's contact info. If there's anything, any questions you might have related to the content within this presentation, please feel free to reach out to Rob. I know, like us, we want to be a resource to you. That's why we're putting on these forums and we're having these discussions. But the big focus today is understanding that we don't need to bring special operators to disinfect and decon our facilities between every event. We know that that's not practical, and it's very much possible for our existing contracts and services to carry out the disinfectant required for COVID. But we really want to make sure we're asking the right questions of our service providers. A lot of us lean heavily on internal or external support through third-party contracts. So the biggest thing is being able to ask the right questions, understand what we should be asking, and getting the right things in position to be successful. So without further ado, we're gonna start wrapping up here. But we certainly want to encourage you to go onto our website after the fact in the next day or so. Again, we'll put this presentation along with the video, make it available to you. We want this to be a resource to you, and we want these tools to be able to assist you in asking the right questions when you're looking at your processes and procedures, and certainly the resources and disinfectants you're currently employing. So again, a big thank you to our presenters here today. We're very grateful for the information you shared. certainly, again, thank you for all that information. Thank you everyone for entrusting us with some of your time this Thursday afternoon. We appreciate all your participation and look forward to seeing you here in the near future at another online forum. So again, thank you. Have a great Thursday and weekend.
Thanks, Daniel.
You can go ahead and shut it.